running a camera because there's actually 3 separate audiences here. I have been asked so many times if there is anything that can be done for a distance version of this class, because it's, for many people, the last hang-up before they can graduate. And in addition, there's a lot of people who would like to take it and for whom it would be useful as part of their degree program when they're doing interdisciplinary work, oftentimes jointly between UAA and UAF. And so we have, in addition to the folks that you'll get to know here, a number of participants who are in Anchorage or in Fairbanks but outside of town or in other places. So in addition to that, there's another complexity in the attempts to kind of create efficiencies. The number of undergrad classes that don't have high enrollments are being canceled, and the number of grad classes being canceled if they are under 5. We create problems because, again, this is a pretty small class. I try to keep it that way, but that means that neither the undergrad version nor the grad version have enough enrollment in it if I don't combine the 2. So we have both the grad version of the class and the undergrad version of the class meeting here jointly. And we're going to have to be really patient with each other and try to balance this. Because I know for some of us, this is all old hat, and she could go a lot faster than this if we had just the grad class meeting. For some of us, this is our first time, hopefully. I'm not speaking out of turn and assuming that. And we would want to spend more time on some of, especially the primary text readings, which can seem kind of complex, especially at first if you're not used to reading communication journals, as you know. So the plan of events is that on Mondays, I'll be lecturing. I'm going to be recording my lectures. I will try to make it more discussion-oriented instead of straight-up lecture, because I realize that gets really dull. But there's a certain amount of just straight-through lecturing that I'm going to have to do. Wednesdays, we're going to split. The undergrad version of the class, I'm going to give you exercises, activities that you have to do out in the community, usually. And you'll be reporting back to us on Fridays with results from your various experiments that you're out there doing. Wednesdays, the grad students will be doing presentations. Fridays, we'll come together, we'll discuss the articles. If you have any comments, questions, thoughts, critiques, and then we'll do a quiz. And the grad students will have a slightly different version of that. The undergrads will have the standard. What I try to do with quizzes is, and if you took OrgCom with me earlier? No. What I try to do with quizzes is that they're designed to test 3 different levels of learning. If you remember back to Bloom's taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy suggests that the lowest level of learning is just reading, and you're only going to remember like maybe 10% of that, usually, on average. And so awareness is that lowest level, and then testing for comprehension, and I'll try to add one comprehension question. Memory is down here as well, by the way. Application is usually thought of as the next higher level of learning. I.e., if you actually really understand this, can you then make the stretch of linking from this to something else that you've learned, either in your life or in another class? And then the highest level is thought of as integration or evaluation, where you can say, okay, this is a great idea, but, or this is a great idea and we can do this with it. It can add to this. We could use it to supplement this. So the quizzes are designed to move you, to try to move through those levels of learning. And so the first question is always something pretty much straight out of the book. If you read it, you should be able to get this. The second question is usually, take this, give me an example from your life. The third question is almost always, what's problematic, or what do you like about this, or what's problematic, what could we do to change it to make it better? And then the grad version will have an extra evaluative question about the epistemology and ontology, linking it back to the additional articles that we'll be reading. The grad version of the class starts with a piece by an author called Stan Dietz, and he lays out a way to think about comparing theories and evaluating theories on a fairly straightforward grid. We're going to be, throughout the course of the semester, comparing it to the way that Griffin lays out the map of the field, and that I know at least one of y'all are familiar with already. So if you look in our textbook, and this is the textbook that we'll all be working from, it is by far the most widely used textbook in this field. Even in Montana, I'm guessing they probably use the exact same thing and do the exact same things with it. If you look on page 47, you'll see the map that we'll be referring back to with the Griffin textbook, and that provides the fundamental overview of the course. The course is laid out such that each week we have a major theorist whose primary work we'll be reading. We'll read their chapter in here, and it will be mapped back to this map, and we go in that order, from basically right to left. And then I add in a few things at the end. So the difficulty with this map, and why Dietz's grid is a probably better way to think about laying out the territory of communication, is that one of the things you'll notice about the map is that it's not really clear how these things relate to one another. Well, we can come back to this later in the semester, but if you had to try to guess what causes a theory to be placed farther to the right versus farther to the left on that grid, would you be able to even guess at what is causing the ordering to go in that right to left order? Well, we'll take some stabs at it as we go along, but the short answer, just preview for you, is that there isn't a real clear way. Indeed, Griffin is kind of ad hocing this, and that's one of the reasons why it's funny shapes that interlock, but they don't mean anything as to why they're in those shapes or in those positions. He's just trying to make you a general principle out of this visual of saying that yes, the theories are not straight boundaries. It's not real clear, like they're not just in a linear continuum. They're some other more complex map. Okay, great. We can say that it's more complex, but we can probably say more useful things if we're willing to get at these underlying assumptions that theories have in common or differ along. And that's why we're going to be getting into talking a lot about epistemology and ontology. Even though those normally, you would argue at me, just in case you were wondering, you would argue back at me that we shouldn't have to take responsibility for epistemology, ontology, because those are philosophy problems. And yeah, we calm people don't have to do that. That's your counter-argument when I start getting too abstract level for you. Okay? Okay, if we're all on board with that, then let me talk a little bit about the mechanics of what we're going to be doing. There are two major things we have to worry about. It's a writing-intensive course. In other words, I have to do a certain amount of not just writing, but instruction on writing and revising of your writing, so that we go through this iterative process a few times. Therefore, the major assignment, and this is true actually for undergrad, for grad, pretty much across the board, is that your final paper will be a fairly long paper, and you'll be revising it over the course of the semester. The paper starts by selecting a topic that you're interested in, something related to communication, hopefully something that you are interested enough in that you might consider it for thesis level. So something that engages your attention, something that is problematic in some way. I give you a couple examples on the syllabus. If you flip through to description of the assignments. And I give you two examples that I work with briefly there. Communication question. Why do my boyfriend and I react so very differently when the cell phone goes off during dinner? He seems to be kind of okay with it. In fact, answers the phone, talks on the phone with me right there. I get really annoyed about it. Or you can flip it around. It's actually pretty gender neutral that way. Why the different reactions? Well, we could theorize about that. And one could select a number of different theories to try to explain this difference. We could, for example, try to think about, is it a gender question? Use a gender-based theory to try to explain, it marks a lack of attention and therefore is considered insulting for one party. The other person regards it as a mark of intimacy, that you trust me enough to be sitting here listening in on all your phone calls. And so it's a mark of trust. One could argue that it's a difference in family backgrounds. I come from a family where there's a ritualized element to eating together, and where that is still carries some of that old sacred significance that like tribal cultures attach to the act of taking a meal together. And if I'm trying to read that symbology into this ritual, then yeah, the intervention of a phone call takes us out of that. Whereas if you're from a family where talking is the marker, is the ritual that we engage in for establishing groupness, insider outsider dichotomy, then to take a phone call is to expand the boundaries of the family, right? And I'm now putting you as part of my social network, do you see? And by including you in my social network, I'm actually reinforcing our bonds. So maybe it's to do with that different family background and what the meaning of the ritual of dinner together is supposed to be. One could explain it in economic terms, potentially, right? One could imagine that interpreting the interruption of the phone call, right? This is my time, and to steal those minutes of phone call list is theft. It makes our social exchange less equal. Because I'm devoting all my attention, you're not devoting all your attention. So our social exchange is off. And you could explain it with social exchange theory, if anybody remembers that. By contrast, one could imagine saying that the handling of phone calls on an ongoing basis is part of the trend that the world is going through. We're all mobile all the time, right? And we're all connected all the time. And so by using this time now efficiently, I'm able to do more overall with the time and relationships, right? And so technological determinism argument, this is what we have to do. We have theories that account for all these things. Your paper asks you to select two and compare and contrast how they explain your phenomenon. Maybe you're not interested in an interpersonal phenomenon like the handling of phone calls during dinner. Maybe you're interested in something a little bit more work-related. So, for example, the question of, do you join a high-performing team or a low-performing team at work? The advantage of joining a low-performing team might be that you could do more with it. So perhaps you can show your skills by transforming that team, right? Gives you a chance to really shine. Argument being, on the counter side, that joining on a high-performing team, you'll get to learn from seeing how others do this. You may not shine as much individually, but you're part of a high-performing team. You can learn how to do that, maybe. Which one do you go for? Well, different theories would recommend different approaches. You pick your two theories. The first 4 pages, roughly, of the paper should outline the phenomenon that you're talking about. So, for example, if you're using the cell phone example, you'll use that first 4 pages to talk about the extent to which cell phones are saturating the US market, what percentage of people actually do have cell phones, what rules exist in other places, how these norms have evolved over time, how do you know those are the norms, like where do you learn about that? it might be interesting to do a little bit of a critical analysis. Critical meaning kind of looking at the ways in which it creates differentials. If I have a nice phone, am I going to be more likely to answer the phone during dinner? Whereas if I have just one of the old non-data plan, barely functional, falling apart phones, am I less likely to answer it during dinner? Is there some sense in which this is a marker of white privilege, right? Or is there some sense in which third world countries actually jump ahead of the United States in cell phone saturation? Did you know, for example, that I think it was Korea had almost no phone access at all until just recently, when all of a sudden, with cell phone towers going up, external investment in the cell phone towers, almost instantly, everybody had a cell phone. And that's in part because the country had never invested in the old infrastructure. In the US, one of the things that you always notice is that technologies are kind of built up in layers. The things that we use a computer first to do are things that we could do with televisions. The things that we use cell phones at first to do are things that we used to do with our land phones, right? That layering, though, also holds us back in some ways. So, for example, the computer keyboard is an outgrowth of our old typewriter technology. And those of you who work with keyboards a lot, you know they're completely dysfunctional. They are literally designed to slow you down. Because with the old typewriters, do you remember how the key comes up? You may not have ever even seen one of those truly old typewriters, have you? Okay, so the old typewriters, the key comes up. If the next one gets hit too soon after, they lock. And so the keys are placed both so that it's unlikely that one will be next to the other. Like, so if you have a combination like E and I that are often together, they'll be on opposite sides of the keyboard, and it's also going to slow you down. Now, instead, all of a sudden, we don't care anymore about the keys interlocking, and we get this horrible mess because we're just doing this constant up-down motion, and this is why we all get carpal tunnel before we hit the age of 40, right? Because that motion is really bad for us. Technologies, then, we talk about building up in layers. And one of the interesting things about communication technologies is the ways in which the norms also are layered. Okay.
They have another one on that one from a professional standpoint of sunk costs. And
Yes!
you have already invested so much in this previous technology that advancing to the next one up is, they talk a lot about it with like the cloud and network computing, and that people don't want to merge, or like UAF doesn't want to go off of its server database because they have invested so much money in actually
And so why are we
purchasing.
still working with this banner thing,
Yeah.
which everybody hates? I don't know whether any of y'all have heard any of the stories, but everybody hates banner, and the trainings for it do not satisfy, but we're in some sense stuck with it because of sunk costs. Also because, by the way, there's another term that I'm going to introduce you to called trained incapacity. The longer that the people who are most invested in working with, for example, banner, or who were most invested in working with the old typewriters, right, are the very people who you would most want to kind of lead the way on the new technologies, but they're going to be also the ones who are most invested in the old. And so it was very difficult to transition away from typewriters because your admin doesn't want to have to learn the new. She's spent, that long. She's really good with the old, and so she will make more mistakes. Not because it's inevitable, but because motivation isn't there, right? And they're motivated, the people who are teaching computers are always teaching you one generation old computer stuff. Do you notice that? Why? Because they've got this trained capacity in this technology. And so they're slower to innovate, oftentimes. And we'll talk about this more later in the semester, but one of the things you'll notice then is that those who are on the margins are often the people who do the most innovating, because they don't have as much sunk. They haven't done as much training on the old, and so they don't have the same training capacities on the new. Very good, very good. Okay, so the steps in writing the paper are that I'm going to ask you to have a proposal ready, and I have it written on the syllabus when that's going to be due. I think. I didn't have it written on the syllabus. I will have to add in those deadlines. But it'll be probably fairly early in the semester. It asks you to identify your topic, explain how it's a communication topic, why it's of interest, what you know about it currently, and then select 5 sources. You don't have to have read those sources yet, but you have to have identified that there are enough sources out there that you'll be able to do some research on this. And they have to be more or less scholarly. Now, some topics, obviously, the scholarly literature isn't necessarily the greatest expertise. Cell phones are another example like this. So there's going to be times when going to the trade publications, for example, is more effective than going to, let me give you another example from another student's paper. He was interested in real estate. He was going to go into selling real estate, and so he was trying to think about whether it's better to have the house looking lived in, or whether it's better to have the house, or under what circumstances is it better to have the house with no signs of individual personalities in it, right? And you can see the argument on both sides, right? Where are you going to go to look for resources to provide good, credible information on this topic? Well, comm journals actually do have some things. In fact, some of the interesting work on identity does start with this question of the markers we use in our living space and territoriality. This is how I indicate territoriality. I have, X statue, or you'll see other places where the instructor, for example, modifies the class space by making sure that there's always a calendar, right? And the time-boundedness that enforces on everybody, right? So there's a lot of study on territoriality. They'll eventually, hopefully, find that term as they're doing their searches in literature, because you'll end up having to spend a little bit of time playing around with different keywords as you enter them into the databases. But there's also these real estate trade publications, and there was some really good stuff in there. People who actually can connect that to dollar values, in fact. So the research takes a little bit longer than you might imagine. I'd encourage you, therefore, to get a head start on it. Be brainstorming right now what your topic is going to be, and get started kind of right away so that you have time to play with these different keyword searches and to find the different databases where they lead you to. And I'll comment on that. I'll go over your writing. So if writing is difficult, that is part of your grade here. Yes, sorry. So if there's troubles, if you know you have troubles, for example, if you know that you are always mixing up its versus its with the apostrophe, get somebody else to glance over it, maybe. Take it to the writing center, definitely, if you can. I'll mark it up, and I'll also start giving you feedback on, okay, so here are a couple of theories that I might think about as being relevant for this. The theories do not necessarily come from the textbook. Indeed, for most of you, you'll be able to find one in the textbook, but you'll probably end up going elsewhere as well. So for example, Psych has a lot of interesting theories that speak very directly to a lot of communication phenomena. Indeed, the boundaries between the two are fuzzy enough that, as you can tell, we overlap in many ways. Any theory that you've learned from another class is fair game. I like for you to be able to integrate across the many, many different things you already know. Take advantage of that, play to your strengths. So while I want at least one of the theories to be related to something we're doing in here, the other one can certainly serve as contrast from elsewhere, or that you come across in your own researching, whatever it may be. Lots of good stuff. Good options. applications, we'll also have a final exam that tests at, in some ways, the lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy that I was drawing for y'all earlier. Memory is in some ways the lowest level. I will argue that theory is the one course in which it actually does make sense to bother with memorizing things. And it's to do with the way in which you would be potentially using it afterwards. If you don't have that all in working memory, it's unlikely to be actually usable when you come across a problem. Moreover, one of the unfortunate drawbacks of how we identify people as calm people is that we talk in a very particular way, and one of the ways is we make references to theorists to try to represent very large abstract problems. And so you'll hear people upstairs. Comm offices are on the 5th floor of this building, by the way, for those of you who didn't know. You'll people hear upstairs, they'll be talking about some problematic encounter they've had, and then they'll just, after a long conversation, carrying on about how this is such an issue, and then they just throw up in their hands and say, expectancy violations. And that's very conveying just a whole world of information. And if you know Burgoon, and if it's in memory, you'll be able to catch that reference, and all of a sudden it's kind of funny, but it's also a real solution to, at least making it easier to live with the problems, even if you're not solving the problems. And I find that one of the key uses of theories is just that. It makes my life an easier life to live because I can kind of justify this. I can explain to myself, this person is not bad. They're operating from this different set of norms. And I can kind of wrap my head around it if I really make an effort at it, but I'm not gonna. And so I'm just gonna attribute it, okay, so that's their social exchange stuff coming back out. Gonna let it go. The longer list of theorists for the grad students, your final exam is going to consist of a series of quotes. There will be one quote from each of those theorists, and you have to be able to tell me which of those theorists it is. For the undergrads, the final exam is in some ways just as bad. You only have to have 10 theorists memorized, and it'll be the 10 that we talk about most. But I'm also going to ask you which position on Griffin's map that theorist represents. And I'm going to ask you to be able to explain in what sense that theorist is an example of rhetorical theory. In what sense is that theorist an example of social psychological theory? In what sense is that theorist an example of? Okay?
Is that part also for the grad students as well? A bigger list plus?
No, you'll only be asked to identify the name.
Oh, okay.
By that time, we will have worked through most of those theorists on our Wednesdays that I send my undergrads to do more interesting experimental type work. And we will identify jointly what that theorist represents, not on Griffin's map, but on Dietz's grid. And so we're going to need to be able to articulate what are the underlying epistemological, what are the underlying ontological assumptions. Moreover, what do those commitments do to the utility of the theory? One of the things I think you'll find over as you study and work with Dietz's grid is that it gives you some heads up in terms of why sometimes a phenomenon that might on the surface look like you can explain it in one of two ways equally, those two theories are not compatible.
Yeah, they're almost diabolically opposed.
Right. And it's hard to articulate that until you develop some vocabulary to articulate what those underlying assumptions are. That this is a theory that is premised on convergence. This one is a theory that is premised on divergence. And so no, those two explanations can't equally be valid for any single phenomenon. Now, one can work from either, but if you try to do research drawing on both, you will trip yourself up. And so when you're out there in the field doing said research, all of a sudden your assumptions are like, you're working against yourself, and it's no fun. So we'll be spending lots of time on Wednesdays trying to go through some of those things. Dietz isn't on our version of the syllabus. Some of y'all, I gave it to you in advance, and so you started working through it already, but that's always what our Wednesday conversations are going to come back to. And I will make sure that everybody gets a copy of that who needs it. Okay. So that's the final exam. The quizzes I've talked about. The presentations, there's going to be a variety of them. The main ones will be the final presentations of your project. You'll also be asked, though, to present on at least one theorist. For some of you, there will be many theorists that you'll be asked to present on because there's only a very small number of us in here. But for the undergrads, you'll only have to do one major theorist presentation. Usually I ask you to select a theorist that is not on our list of primary theorists, so that you're adding something new for us. I hope that my Monday lectures will be sufficient, that we will all have heard enough about Burgoon by the end of the day that, yeah, no, we're done with that, thank you. Even though in some ways, I'm sure there's more that could be said. With that in mind, what I'd like to do actually is see where we're starting from, all of us. And so, transitioning to a discussion section for a while.
Dr. Taylor,
Yeah.
I don't know how to say it, but just say it, and please forgive me, but I have to leave in 5 minutes. Yeah,
You teach, and you have things you need to do before then.
yeah. It really was kind of disastrous yesterday in Anchorage with all of that, so, yeah.
Well, actually, this would probably be a good time then to slip
Just
out.
that one? Okay.
The video will be conveniently available
Oh, good.
online,
Well, no, that's
and I
good.
will hold you
Yes.
responsible for at least glancing over what the rest of your peers in here
Yes.
conclude by the end of our conversation, because we will be coming to some judgments before much longer. Let's start though with seeing, all of y'all have had comm classes before, and so let's see what we remember from them. Starting by picking on you, Lenny. This is your penalty for being you late. So you have to go first. Tell me a theorist that you remember from one of your other comm classes. First off, what have you taken from your comm classes beforehand?
I've taken COM 180.
Okay, so you should remember some things from there, maybe.
That was my second semester.
Yeah.
COM 180, or intercultural communication,
Excellent.
communication, health,
Excellent.
and those are all of the COM classes that I've taken, not required by everybody else, or for the major. However, I think I remember the theories a little bit more than the theorists themselves.
That's fine. That's totally
So-
fair. Tell me theories then instead of theorists.
Okay.
Yeah, excellent. Good.
I want to say there is one that I remember from the health communication class, which focused on different levels of trying to pull it from my bank, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Focus on different levels. Like, actually, I have a paper from it.
No. I'm actually, we're using the memory question because, and also you don't actually go do research on this, please. What I'm trying to see is if there are things that make theories better able to stick in memory, and if you're jogging your memory, I can't actually test the theories, because this is one way that we might consider evaluating theories, right? I was talking before about how there's this kind of cachet around being able to toss around theory names. But let's see, if it actually makes sense that theories are better if there are things about theories that make them stick in memory, that make them work that way. So I can think of a couple of different theories that might be talked about in terms of levels. Let me toss a couple names at you and see if those.
And I
Okay.
think it was about like coming to terms with oneself in like an addiction maybe or something.
Oh, okay.
I'm not positive.
Okay.
But like to make a change or to make a change to your lifestyle.
Okay, so that's probably actually Dr. Ritchie's model that you're talking about, that she was using as probably the kind of underlying structure for the class.
Yeah.
I think probably the one that you'll find it has most in common with that we'll be talking about is coordinated management of meaning. What else do we remember, forcing you now on the spot to think back to 180? Do you remember anything from that one? That
Absolute basics of communication, two theories. One that I believe it was the conduit, where stuff was going directly, and then there was both ways, or like the feedback loop as well.
Good. And that rings bells for others of y'all also, I trust. That the problems with the conduit metaphor, sender receiver, noise in channel. Yeah, good. So the theorists' names, by the way, are Shannon and Weaver, and usually what we're doing with it is taking it apart. There's also, though, a lot of ways in which we still do rely on that model pretty heavily. And so it keeps coming back up and coming back up. One of them that you probably met in 180 is one that I mentioned already. When I said expectancy violation, it seemed like most of y'all recognized what the heck I was referring to. Yeah, no, maybe?
Oh.
No, okay. But you do, now that I trigger your memory.
A little bit, I think.
Ronnie? Yeah, no, maybe? Expectancy violation at all?
Maybe.
Okay. The idea that oftentimes when things go wrong in communication, like in interpersonal interactions, it's because you've done something, not that it's a wrong thing to do, because it might be a perfectly fine thing to do, but it violates my expectations. And that's where we get all these rules about standing distance in particular, for example. It's really strong on nonverbals. We'll talk about it more. But expectation tends to be one that people often remember because that word is such an important part of our language that we use anyways. And so one of the arguments I'm going to make is that one of the reasons why the theories stay in memory is if they do a really good job of capturing common sense that we live with every day. And if there's something that gets expressed anyways in language, and this gives us kind of better handle on it, that's one of the things that tends to be a marker of good theory. Maybe. Arguably. Ronnie, what theories do you remember? Or what classes have you had first? Let me ask that, because I don't really know.
Communicating ethics,
Good.
management, and interpersonal relationships. I think I have one more, but I just can't remember. It was with Gene Ritchie.
Okay. So, gender, did you take that one yet?
I'm taking that now.
Yeah. Okay. You must have had 180 also, though, right? The intro class?
No, I'm taking that yet.
Okay. What do you remember from, say, interpersonal?
Yeah, I remember. I remember a lot of nonverbals, and it was one theory where it was more like listening and reactions, but I'm not
That's okay.
it was, but it was where it was how you can listen to a situation and not even have to respond to actually comfort, you know, the person who has the problem,
Right. Good.
but just showing your senses of being
Fully,
engaged into
fully there.
Yeah.
Yeah. The theorist's name is Martin Buber, and I'm blanking on the usual label that gets applied in terms of names. But anyways, that's the theorist. Here's a curious question for you, maybe. Why is it that as one gets more advanced in the field, one starts, instead of thinking about the theory as kind of this gestalt, you know, what it does, which is what we're getting mostly, right? That's where we all start from. Why do we start more and more often referring to it by the person's name? What is that indicating about what the heck's going on in our discipline?
The time that they were researching?
One of the convenient things it does for me is it does organize it
Chronologically.
chronologically. And that might be really bad because somehow or another that's an evaluative judgment, right? Why do I care? I shouldn't, probably, except that I keep coming back and doing so. And it influences a lot of how I react to different theories. So knowing that this is a World War II era theory tells me certain things about it, like what kinds of contexts. And knowing in particular that Buber was, in fact, one of the people in the concentration camps influences how I react to that theory. What are the other things that it's marking about what can we learn just from the very fact that our discipline relies so heavily on names? What does it tell us about it?
Reference.
Right. One of the reasons it's really important is because it controls the flow of social capital. In other words, each time you are able to refer to his theory and demonstrate that awareness, it's like a +1 in his box. And he becomes more important. And as a mark of being more important, it's more likely to get taught to others. It's more likely to get used in research. It's more likely to start influencing the world in that way. Very indirectly. But your remembering that is a small, little tiny way in which we continuously strive to kind of balance the world and make it a little bit, tiny bit better in our communication practices. Does that make sense? It's also really important for theorists that are alive today because it controls things like what kind of salary one can demand in the discipline. It controls things like what kinds of future research are more likely to get done. And so that's one of the other things that's going on with the linking of individuals as names to theories. Now, my saying it that way should cue some of you into another thing that we're doing when we keep linking theorists' names and keep turning that into the shorthand by which we refer to these things, these abstractions. What am I doing when I keep inserting a name instead of the more abstract idea?
It's easier to remember that way.
Well, it might, yeah, I
I
mean,
mean, in terms of like, you're not gonna
Eventually.
get them all mixed up.
Kind of showing that it is a field of specialization.
and I'm demonstrating my adherence to these Western norms about individuals being the locus of knowledge.
As opposed to entire groups.
Right, right. As opposed to entire groups, or as opposed to knowledge being kind of somewhere out there, and I don't really need a person to link to it, that it's apparent to all of us at some level. And so we reinforce Western ideals of individualism, capitalism, but also individual effort, right? The brain as the source of power. And so those are things that, I'm not saying it's bad that we're doing that. I think it's probably inevitable. But it's not neutral either that I refer to theorists by the theorist's name. And that you will be too before the end of the semester. By God. Like it or not. Any other theories that you particularly remember from interpersonal or from ethics?
I learned a lot in interpersonal. I think that's what I remember most of them from. I just can't pinpoint it, you know. It's just, but there's so much. I also took indigenous dispute resolution.
Oh,
I
excellent.
just took that over the summer, and I actually learned a lot from, I think,
Holly.
Castling. Is
Oh.
that her name? No, that was, I think she was maybe, it was her book.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Excellent. So any dispute resolution theories that you particularly remember? If I throw a term at you, will it trigger it, do you think?
Maybe.
Escalation? Escalation and de-escalation? No.
No, not that one.
Okay. A lot of the times when we start talking about dispute resolution, it's because there's oftentimes a sense that left to their own devices, conflicts have a nasty, bad habit of escalating in ways that neither individual involved in the conflict or neither party involved in the conflict really chooses. And so, U.S. builds a new weapons defense system, shooting down missiles. What's going to be almost inevitably, it seems like the next thing that happens. Russia's going to develop missiles in space, right? Or something. And there's some sense in which that arms race is not the choice of either of the participants, but just becomes this kind of inevitable imperative driven by the conflict itself, because I have to match your move. But the matching always gets interpreted as a scaling up. So we talk about it as escalation.
Yeah.
And the theorist's name that we usually associate with that is going to escape me right now. It'll come back. One of the other things that you might have caught in our earlier conversation and that might trigger memory if I throw it at you, social exchange.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So most of us are familiar with social exchange theory. It has permeated. It's gone from the comm literature. I think it originated in comm literature anyways. Certainly the version of it I know did. It now permeates popular culture. How do I prove that to you? I can quote Shrek at you. What's the quote from Shrek that illustrates our social exchange theory? You've all seen Shrek, please. I'm not that old.
Actually, I've seen Shrek. I'm just not quite sure which quote.
You've seen Shrek.
The first one.
It's the first one, the only one. It's the only Shrek. What's the famous quote?
The only quote that I know is donkey.
Oh, okay. The one that I usually think of is ogres are like onions, right? Okay, that's social exchange theory. Layers. Levels, if you wish. But the argument about layers suggests that people, similarly, right, 'cause the ogre is just, the point of the movie is that he's just another person, right? Okay, so people are complex and that we come in layers, and that as you get to know us better, you get down to some true core of the person. Right? Social exchange. Right. Problematic. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with ogres like onions as a model for people?
I was just gonna say that there's no core in onions, but I wasn't sure if
There's
that's the
no
correct
core in
answer.
people either. Or at least because if such a thing exists, we sure haven't seen proof of it. People change, right? To imply that there's a core is to suggest that there's some stable constant.
There's like a true.
A true, and authenticity is really problematic as a concept. To argue that there's a core is to suggest that I can A, have perfect knowledge of myself, which we have relatively little evidence to suggest. Indeed, most evidence suggests quite to the contrary, that we have relatively little awareness of our own internal selves without putting a lot of work into it. And if you need proof of that, think about all the persuasion theories and how much of the time they work on the basis of knowing you better than you know yourself, right? Knowing what are the triggers. I know how to control the fact that I can make you take dessert first, or make you take dessert as part of your meal at a cafeteria based on how I display it.
I'm reading this book right now. It's about basically like the unconscious mind, how you don't really, like there's the conscious part and then there's all this stuff
But most
happening
of it's-
behind it. And just like how basically, this book is arguing that you don't really have any control over it. I don't know about necessarily.
I don't know about that, but
it's
right.
just, it's really interesting, just like, you know, all these things that you do without really noticing, you know, like when somebody walks into the room, you look to see who it is, just all these things that before your mind registers that somebody came in the room, just like, oh, it's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So all of those are com-related then as well, because these are part of how we form our judgments about each other. These are the meanings that we attribute. Your turn. Tell me a theory that you remember. Even if it's not a com theory, tell me a theory.
I mean, I took interpersonal communication 3.5 years ago. Like, I honestly feel like this situation might be a little overwhelming.
Oh no, not at all. That's okay. Do you remember anything from any of your psych classes though?
And like I said, it's been a really long time since I've been in psych too. So.
Oh, okay. It's actually, I would be curious to know, because I bet they describe some of these same phenomena in different terms. Mary, what do you remember?
Well, I remember semiotics and linguistic relativity, groupthink, cybernetics.
Groupthink. So that's trigger bells for others?
1984.
Yeah. Irving Janis is the name that goes with it, by the way, just for the record. Kate, share a theory.
Well, I come from a background of being a graphic designer, which nobody knows about, like ligatures and stuff, and then community development. And the biggest basis as far as learning from community development is that there's an agitation versus annoyance. And so the annoyance is these planners coming in and saying that you're going to build your community this way and this is what you should do, and this outside presence, and that it doesn't hold true, versus the agitation, which is getting people to do something that they already want to do. They already want to make their community better in this way, and this is how we're going to do it.
That term?
Yeah.
That's the way we usually talk about that in COM, and the name that goes with that is Habermas. And hopefully we'll get a chance to come back and talk about Habermas, because it's really cool. What do you notice in common about theories that tend to stick in memory better?
They're applied.
They tend to be really applied. They are, for the most part, what we call mid-level theories. These are not hugely abstract, partly because that makes them harder to apply. But they're not hugely abstract. Like the really big, high-level abstract theories often don't stick in memory quite as well. And so theories of ethics, such as instrumentalism, right? Yeah, but it doesn't stick. Why not?
Maybe because it's not applied on an everyday basis.
It's so abstract that it's hard to fill in kind of the places where it can be applied.
Where you can use
Right. Right.
Also, most of those ones at least, like you look at the one word groupthink, and it's kind of it's like a trigger expect.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, like we all know what those words mean, even in like.
Actually, do we all know what those words, I mean, individually we know what the words are.
Yeah.
Can somebody take a moment to just briefly groupthink for the rest of us? Because you recognize it in terms of 1984. Do you want to explain?
I think it's the same idea of like mob mentality sort of idea that you kind of go along with the higher. I mean, you can even take it to the athletic sort of thing. It's not the I am doing this, it's the we are doing this, and the we can become very powerful and override the I.
Yeah, okay, good. And it's curious that you choose athletics as an illustration of that, because the easiest case I know of to illustrate it does. It starts though, and the theorists first started worrying about those things in terms of politics. In general, we assume groups are more effective for decision making than individuals. And if any of you took 131, you've seen, I hope, some illustrations of that. Groups take longer, but they tend to come to better decisions, right? More often than not. Every once in a while, though, there are two problems that groups run into. Every once in a while, they do what we call group polarization, i.e., a group that is asked to determine an investment strategy will often make far riskier investments than any individual in that group would have ever chosen on their own. And Ron is a nice case in point, by the way. The problem tends to arise because the members egg each other on, right? And there's some kind of sense in which hearing everybody else in the group talk about positioning themselves around this risk point, the inclination is to argue for the next step forwards. The group is going to respond almost always by accepting those arguments and then topping them, because now we're in agreement that the criteria is we want to maximize return on investment. All of the risk language goes right on out the window. Yeah.
Is that experiment where they had basically somebody come into a classroom, but he was the only one that wasn't part of the experiment?
Yes.
And he sits down at the desk, and basically they're showing a, I don't know, like they're showing like which is the longest pole,
Longest line.
longest line, or the biggest square, and everybody else in the room is voting for something that's incorrect, but they're all part of the subject, and he's the only one, but he goes along with the rest of them because
Right.
of, like, he, you know, either
Right.
he's afraid to speak his mind, or
No, he
thinks that
actually
he's
starts
wrong. He
changing his
actually thinks he's
perceptions,
wrong.
right. If everybody in the group is saying this line is longer, your perceptions shift.
You're like, well, I'm
And
probably
it's
wrong.
really funny. Similarly, one of the things that goes really badly wrong sometimes in groups is ethics go out the window. And groups can make some of the most amazingly unethical, stupid decisions, much more so than any individual in that group would ever do on their own.
Yeah, well, like not necessarily as a group, but kind of the authority figure.
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading. Like you could.
And that's why she's thinking about it in terms of 1984, because the conditions under which this is particularly likely to happen are under conditions of external authority.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Strong external authority is likely to remove the group's own internal ethics checks. And so if we all set aside our conscience, gee, big surprise. Groups make some really unethical decisions. The classic example that Janice was working with was the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. Stupid decision, unethical decision, problematic even still down to today, right? Huge repercussions. Small group, strong external authority because they were answering directly to a president who was really among the first of what we call the imperial presidency. Kennedy was pretty bad about exerting the authority of the office. And that's a trend we see continuing, but he was one of the early ones of it. For all that I love him, because he was a great speaker. And I love quoting him. But he does some dumb things. So one of the things that we notice is that they tend to be mid-level theories. There are also what we call low-level theories. So for example, I can have a theory of comm classes. I have a theory of comm classes that they need to be more discussion-based because comm majors tend to be talkative. Okay, that's a pretty disprovable theory. It's also a very low-level theory. It's not going to stick in anybody's mind other than my own, because why would you remember it? Right? It's not useful. It's not generalizable. It's not going to apply to other places. It's not. We tend to have a theory of each other as well. So we will have a theory of Leonard before the end of the semester. You probably already have a nascent theory of Leonard, even though you've only met him like 5 seconds ago or whatever. We start formulating this larger picture, and if you were asked, you would be able to, if pressed, say, yeah, I might guess that maybe he would listen to.
Hip-hop.
Okay. Right? Would you guess that he is a night owl or an early morning person?
Early morning.
Night owl.
Both.
Both? Oh my god.
He never sleeps.
And insomnia.
But just, I don't even tell them whether they're right or not.
Okay.
Because that is so not the point. What's the point that I'm making with this?
Though we have assumptions about.
We have assumptions and they link to each other. And one of the things about theories that helps make them memorable is that they are interrelated to each other. That's a long-winded way for me to have gotten to that. Might seem like a really simple, obvious point, but I hope you realize that one of the things that comes out of that is the fact that as we learn more theories, and given that they're all very interrelated, they tie, so that if you have a theory about what it means to be an early riser versus a late night person, or a non-sleeping person altogether, right? That ties to your thoughts about musical tastes, that ties to your thoughts about whether they have a pet, or, right? Similarly, all of our theories here tie together. So your world becomes, hopefully, that much more rich. You become that much more capable of responding to situations as they arise. My goal for you by the end of this class is that you're able to respond more adaptively on the basis of having knowledge of theories. I hope you will be, in fact, less committed to any single theory than you are currently, that you will have more of them in memory, and that you will flip between them with greater ease so that they're all there and you can move among them easily. So that is our goal long term, I hope for you. Questions?
What's an example of a high-level theory? So we did.
So the example was instrumentalism that I gave to you of a very high level, abstract level theory. Can anybody tell me what instrumentalism is? Coming from your ethics class? What does it sound like?
Sounds like you could play it.
Oh, that makes it a lot nicer. I like it. All of a sudden it starts being fun. In general, instrumentalism is kind of the argument about the right thing is the greatest good for the most people. The problem with instrumentalism is, and it's usually a critique, we talk about these very high-level theories more often negatively as problems that are underscoring a lot of different theories. The argument is that it tends towards ends versus means reasoning, i.e. instrumentalism assumes that if the goal is right, then we do need to talk about how to get there, but there's some sense in which, right, there's some sense in which people are part of process. We
Or
lose
just
something.
tends to a mean.
Right. Right. Instrumentalist ethics. The classic example given of instrumentalist ethics, Immanuel Kant makes the argument that you should do nothing save that you will it to become the universal norm. I.e., don't lie, ever, unless you want everybody to lie, all the time. What happens then? Well, the obvious problem with, right, this kind of universalist ethics, obviously I don't want everybody to lie all the time, because then language is dysfunctional, completely. On the other hand, do you really want to stand by and say, don't lie ever? There's a madman at the door, and he wants to know if his wife is hiding within. She is. You're gonna lie. You know you're gonna lie. Come on. Not a one of you would tell the truth in that situation, really, right? I mean, unless you thought you had a way to deal with him. In which case, sure, come at me. Right? Right. So, it's process-based, right? Do you see what I mean? This kind of goal orientation and how it's problematic. Okay, that's an example of high-level theorizing. And what happens, the problem with high-level theorizing is that it breaks down when you get down to it. Almost always. There are high-level theories that don't. Let me give you an example of another really seriously high-level theory. How many of you remember from your public speaking, I'm sorry?
My office hours.
Oh shoot,
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Bye.
Okay, all of y'all are responsible for keeping me on task because I don't keep track of time. I get really into my theory, in case you couldn't tell. Let me toss out just for the record, Aristotle's Ethos, Pathos, Logos that you might remember from your public speaking classes. Another example of seriously high-level theory. What's problematic about it? Anytime you try to apply, it fits, sure, but it doesn't give you anything really specific. How do you do better? Right? And that's why we kind of got frustrated with it when we were teaching public speaking. Yes, okay, good. That does stay in memory. It does stay in memory. I was a little bit wrong about what makes theory stay in memory. Okay, we'll have to continue this conversation. I look forward to, on Monday, everybody will have read, and we will talk further. If anybody needs a copy of the syllabus still, did everybody get? Okay, very good. Thank y'all. And Caitlin will stop the camera because it's